Beverly Hills, Sunday night, August 20, 1989. North Elm Drive is quiet in the way only wealthy neighborhoods are quiet. No sirens, no shouting, no sense of urgency. Large homes sit back from the street behind low fences. Garden lights cast soft pools of yellow across carefully trimmed lawns. This is a place where danger is not expected, where violence feels out of place, almost impolite. Inside a white mansion, the Menendez family living room is softly lit. On a large couch sit Jose Menendez and his wife, Kitty. The evening has been ordinary, no guests, no celebration, nothing to suggest that within minutes, this house will become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in modern American history. Then the gunfire begins. Not one shot, not two, but a violent sequence of shotgun blasts fired at close range inside an enclosed space. The sound tears through the stillness of Beverly Hills, but not loudly enough to immediately bring neighbors to their phones. In this neighborhood, people are not accustomed to hearing gunshots, and sometimes the expectation of safety delays the recognition of danger. When it is over, two people are dead on the living room couch. Blood splatters the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. There is no sign of struggle, no chance to escape, and at that moment, the identity of the killers is not yet spoken aloud. The 911 call comes in at 10:47 p.m. On the other end of the line is Lyle Menendez. His voice is breaking. He is crying uncontrollably. He tells the operator that his parents have been shot, that something terrible has happened, that he does not know what to do. To the dispatcher, it sounds like countless other emergency calls: a grieving son, a sudden tragedy, a home transformed into a crime scene. Nothing in the call suggests that the man speaking might be responsible for what has just occurred. When Beverly Hills police arrive, even seasoned officers hesitate at the doorway. Jose Menendez has been shot multiple times in the head and chest. The shotgun blasts have nearly destroyed his face. Kitty Menendez lies on the floor beside the couch. Later forensic analysis will show that she was shot while trying to crawl away, and that the final blast entered her face as she lay on her back. There is no evidence of a prolonged fight, no reports from neighbors of screaming or panic. Everything happens fast, brutal, decisive, and overwhelming. One veteran investigator will later describe the scene in a single sentence. This wasn't a killing. It was an execution. In the first hours, detectives do what they always do. They search for signs of forced entry. The doors are intact. The windows are unbroken. Nothing appears ransacked. Valuables remain in place: watches, jewelry, artwork. In a typical robbery homicide, this would make little sense. But given the wealth of the family and the location, investigators initially lean toward an external explanation: a business rival, a failed robbery, or a targeted attack. No one says it outright that night, but the thought crosses a few minds. The killer may not have needed to break in. The couple's two sons are taken to the police station for questioning. Lyle, 21 years old, Eric, 18. They say they were out at the movies that evening. When they returned home, they found their parents dead. They panicked. They called 911. The story seems plausible. The timeline does not immediately fall apart. Both young men appear shaken, emotional, disoriented. In family homicide cases, investigators often begin by scrutinizing the closest relatives. But here, social context matters. The Menendez family is wealthy, respected, and well-connected. The image of two privileged sons slaughtering their parents does not fit easily into familiar categories. For the first 48 hours, Lyle and Eric Menendez are not treated as primary suspects. To understand why this case will later divide the country, it is necessary to understand who the Menendez family is. Jose Menendez is a powerful entertainment executive. He has held senior positions, earned substantial income, and built a reputation as a driven and demanding leader. To many Cuban immigrants, he represents the American dream, arriving with little, working relentlessly, and rising to the top. But success comes with another reputation. Former colleagues describe him as controlling, volatile, and intolerant of failure, especially in his children. Mistakes are not learning opportunities. They are weaknesses to be crushed. Expectations are absolute. Kitty Menendez lives largely in her husband's shadow. She rarely appears publicly. Neighbors describe her as quiet, sometimes unstable, often withdrawn. She does not appear to be the decision-maker in the household. From the outside, the family looks perfect, wealthy, disciplined, accomplished. From an investigative perspective, families that appear flawless often conceal the deepest fractures. In the weeks after the funeral, subtle warning signs emerge. The brothers begin spending money fast, expensive cars, luxury watches, European travel. More than $700,000 disappears in a matter of months. To an outsider, this could simply be the behavior of young men suddenly in control of significant wealth. To investigators, it raises questions. In post-crime behavioral analysis, there is a concept known as psychological leakage, the unconscious release of emotional pressure after an act of extreme violence. Excessive spending, lack of visible mourning, and reckless behavior can indicate relief rather than grief. It is not proof, but it is not meaningless. The true turning point does not come from interrogation. It comes from a therapist's office. Eric Menendez seeks psychological treatment for anxiety, panic attacks, and insomnia. During one session, he breaks down, and through tears, he admits that he and his brother killed their parents. This confession is not made to police. It is spoken in what Eric believes to be a confidential setting, but the information does not stay contained. It is shared, it circulates, and eventually it reaches law enforcement. When detectives return to the case with a new hypothesis that the killers may be the sons, everything looks different. Shotguns were purchased in advance, with cash. False names were used. The weapons are gone. The alibi contains gaps. The pieces begin to align, but in criminal investigation, identifying who committed the act is only half the job. The harder question is why. Why would two young men, raised in wealth, with no public history of violence, turn shotguns on their own parents? The answer they will give when finally heard will shock the courtroom, divide the public, and force the justice system to confront something it is deeply uncomfortable addressing: prolonged sexual abuse hidden behind the walls of a powerful family. What follows will not be a simple murder trial. It will be a reckoning with fear, silence, and the limits of how the law understands trauma. The door is about to open, and once it does, it cannot be closed again. Once the theory of an outside intruder begins to collapse, the investigation enters its most difficult phase, examining a powerful, wealthy family whose secrets leave no physical trace. In cases like these, evidence is rarely found on the floor or in a safe. It exists in memory, in long-suppressed fear, and in years of silence mistaken for stability. The brothers are summoned again, this time no longer as grieving witnesses, but as suspects. The interview room is quiet. The questions shift away from timelines and toward relationships, dinner conversations, discipline, punishment, conflict. At first, Their answers are careful, short, controlled. To seasoned investigators, this restraint is familiar. It is not the silence of guilt, but the silence of people who learned early that speaking carries consequences. The testimony that changes everything. When Eric begins to speak openly, the atmosphere changes. He does not talk about money. He does not talk about inheritance. He talks about nights that never seemed to end, about fear that returned again and again, about power that could not be challenged. He describes prolonged sexual abuse by his father, abuse that he says began when he was very young and continued for years. For investigators, allegations like these present a profound challenge. There are no medical records, no contemporaneous reports, no witnesses who saw it happen. Everything depends on words, on consistency, on emotional coherence, on psychological patterns that cannot be photographed or bagged as evidence. That does not mean they are ignored. Investigators and psychologists begin searching for indirect indicators, panic responses, dissociation, deep-rooted shame, contradictory attachment to the abuser. These are patterns frequently observed in survivors of long-term familial abuse. A father through an investigative lens, Jose Menendez is described by many who knew him as a man who demanded absolute control. Discipline in the household was not instructional. It was authoritarian. Success was expected. Failure was not tolerated. Colleagues recall explosive anger, public humiliation, and an obsession with dominance. In criminal psychology, such traits do not establish guilt, but they do describe an environment where boundaries erode when power goes unchecked. No one comes forward claiming to have witnessed abuse directly, but several people recall the son's visible fear around their father, the rigid rules, the atmosphere of constant evaluation. For investigators, the picture is incomplete, but it is not empty. The mother's role, absence, or betrayal. Kitty Menendez emerges in the record as a quieter, more ambiguous figure. She is portrayed as emotionally fragile, dependent on her husband, and prone to depression. The critical question is not whether she abused her children, but whether she knew and failed to intervene. In many abuse cases, the non-abusing parent becomes psychologically complicit through inaction. For a child, this absence of protection can feel like betrayal. Love, fear, anger, and guilt become entangled, forming a bond that confuses loyalty with survival. Experts explain that when children believe no one will protect them, defensive responses may build silently for years. When those defenses finally activate, they often do so explosively without the measured logic expected by outsiders. Why victims do not report public skepticism often hinges on a single question: why didn't they report it? Modern investigative psychology offers many answers. Victims fear retaliation. They fear disbelief. They rely financially and emotionally on their abusers. They feel shame. And over time, abuse becomes normalized. In families that value appearance and success, disclosure threatens everything. Silence becomes a duty. The cost of speaking feels higher than the cost of enduring. Investigators do not treat silence as proof that abuse did not occur. They treat it as a psychological data point, one that must be evaluated within context. Fear in the present tense. The brothers' account does not remain in the past. They describe a growing belief that their parents intended to kill them, to silence them permanently. This claim becomes one of the most contentious aspects of the case. Prosecutors argue it is speculative and self-serving. Defense experts argue it reflects trauma-driven perception, where prolonged fear alters threat assessment. Psychology recognizes a phenomenon known as delayed survival activation. When a person has lived under threat for years, their nervous system may respond to danger cues long before objective proof appears. This does not excuse homicide, but it can explain how fear overrides rational alternatives. Investigators note something critical. While some details vary, the emotional core of the brothers' accounts remains consistent. In statement analysis, emotional consistency often carries more weight than chronological precision. A battle of experts from this point forward, the investigation transforms into a clash of interpretations. Prosecutors emphasize planning, preparation, and concealment. Defense teams present experts on trauma, abuse, and post-traumatic stress. Both sides construct narratives that explain the same facts in radically different ways. The burden now shifts to a future jury, individuals with no training in psychology, asked to weigh competing explanations for human behavior under extreme conditions. Media pressure and public framing. As details emerge, media coverage simplifies the story: wealthy sons, lavish spending, dead parents. The narrative of greed is easier to digest than the reality of hidden abuse. Claims of sexual violence, especially involving male victims from privileged backgrounds, are treated with suspicion. Many outlets frame them as tactics rather than testimony. Investigators understand the danger of this framing. Courtrooms do not operate on public opinion, but public opinion influences everything surrounding them. The unresolved divide. By the end of this investigative phase, nothing is conclusively resolved. Instead, the case splits into two equally plausible interpretations. One depicts cold, calculated murder motivated by inheritance. The other depicts a desperate act born from years of fear and control. Cases like this are the most dangerous, not because they lack evidence, but because the evidence supports more than one truth. And when that happens, justice depends not only on facts, but on how those facts are allowed to be told. The courtroom doors are about to open, and what happens next will force an entire nation to choose which version of reality it is willing to accept. After the first trial ends without a verdict, the Menendez case enters a brief but tense pause. For the public, it feels like exhaustion. For the media, it is a void waiting to be filled. For prosecutors and defense attorneys, it is an opportunity, one that will determine whether the case ends in ambiguity or finality. Everyone involved understands that the second trial will not resemble the first. The American justice system does not tolerate prolonged uncertainty, especially in cases that capture national attention. This time, the court is expected to deliver a clear conclusion. To do that, the rules change. A judge redraws the boundaries. The second trial proceeds before a single jury, hearing the cases against both brothers together. Early rulings by the judge reshape the entire landscape. Testimony related to sexual abuse is sharply limited. Psychological narratives that dominated the first trial are constrained to narrow legal relevance. The justification is procedural. The court determines that extensive discussion of past abuse does not meet the standard required to establish lawful self-defense. But in practice, this decision removes the defense's central framework. Context, which once carried emotional weight, is reduced to fragments. In criminal investigations, context often explains behavior. In court, only admissible context survives. A recalibrated prosecution with the defense's narrative restricted. The prosecution is free to reconstruct its case with precision. This time, the story is linear and restrained, almost clinical. The brothers purchased shotguns using cash. They used false names. They brought the weapons home. They fired multiple times. They staged the scene. They spent lavishly afterward. Each step is presented as evidence of deliberation. The jury is no longer asked to navigate psychological complexity. They are asked one question only. Did the defendants know what they were doing? Under this framing, the answer appears straightforward. Changing perceptions without extended testimony about fear and trauma, Lyle and Eric are seen differently. They are no longer framed primarily as damaged children. They are framed as young adults capable of planning and deception. Behavior that once seemed ambiguous now carries new weight. Post-crime spending is no longer discussed as psychological release. It is described as motive. In investigations, facts do not change, but meaning does. The jury's burden, simplified, the second jury does not face two equally developed narratives. One is clear, supported by physical evidence and behavior. The other is constrained, fragmented, and incomplete. This imbalance simplifies deliberation. It also raises an unspoken question. How much of the truth is being excluded in the name of legal efficiency? The law requires clarity. Trauma rarely provides it. The verdict, when the jury returns, the atmosphere is tense but unsurprised. Both brothers are found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence follows immediately: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There are no outbursts, no dramatic reactions, only stillness. For the prosecution, the verdict represents justice served. For the defense, it represents a story never fully told. Public response and lingering doubt. The verdict does not end debate, it transforms it. Some feel relief that the case has finally reached resolution. Others feel unease, sensing that something essential was left outside the courtroom. Legal commentators question whether psychological evidence should be constrained so tightly in cases involving long-term abuse. They ask whether excluding context risks judging actions without understanding origins. The second trial answers the legal question. It leaves the moral one unresolved. What the second trial represents in investigative circles, the second Menendez trial becomes a case study in procedural power. The same crime, the same defendants, a different outcome achieved not through new evidence, but through altered boundaries of what can be said. The trial does not declare that abuse never occurred. It declares only that it did not carry sufficient legal weight within the permitted framework, and the distance between not legally sufficient and not real is one the public often misunderstands. Toward an uncertain future, as the brothers are led away, the courtroom closes on one version of events. But outside, the conversation continues in law schools, psychology journals, and quiet debates about justice and responsibility. The case is no longer about guilt or innocence. It is about limits. Limits of law, limits of narrative, limits of how institutions handle trauma. And with that, the Menendez case enters its final phase, not in court, but in memory. When the courtroom doors close after a sentence of life without parole, the public often assumes the story has ended. The law has spoken. Justice, at least in its formal sense, has been delivered. But in cases rooted in family violence and long-term trauma, a verdict rarely functions as a full stop. It is more often a transition into a quieter, longer chapter that unfolds far from cameras and headlines. Lyle and Eric Menendez enter the California prison system not as anonymous inmates, but as men carrying one of the most scrutinized case files in American criminal history. Inside, Notoriety offers no clarity. It brings isolation, scrutiny, and a daily negotiation with an identity frozen at the moment of conviction. Life after the sentence for years. The brothers are housed in separate facilities. The separation follows protocol, but its psychological impact is significant. For two men whose survival strategies were built around each other, isolation becomes its own form of punishment. Those who encounter them during this period describe different adaptations. Eric is quiet, introspective, committed to therapy and education. Lyle is more outwardly engaged, studying legal procedure, filing motions, maintaining correspondence. Two paths shaped by the same confinement. Prison does not ask why. It only enforces the result. Time changes the conversation as decades pass. The world outside evolves. Concepts that were once marginalized, male sexual abuse, trauma-informed psychology, post-traumatic stress in domestic settings, enter mainstream understanding. Research expands. Language improves. Silence becomes less acceptable. These changes do not undo convictions, but they alter perspective. Legal scholars begin to revisit the Menendez case, not to re-argue guilt, but to question proportionality. If the same facts were presented today, with broader acceptance of trauma science, would the courtroom allow the full story to be heard? The question remains hypothetical but persistent. Attempts at reconsideration over the years. Petitions are filed seeking resentencing or review. Some challenge the procedural limits imposed during the second trial. Others introduce statements from individuals who say they observed disturbing behavior in the Menendez household. Still others rely on modern psychological evaluations. The legal threshold for reversal is high. Stability of verdicts is a cornerstone of the justice system. New interpretations are rarely enough. What courts demand is new evidence, clear, decisive, and undeniable. In this case, the line between new evidence and newly understood evidence remains contested. Public debate returns each documentary, article, or podcast renews public interest, and each time the same divide resurfaces. One side emphasizes planning, deception, and financial gain. The other emphasizes fear, coercion, and survival. What has changed is the tone. The conversation is less binary, more careful. The question shifts from, did they do it, to, does the punishment reflect the full reality? This evolution signals something important. The case has become less about verdicts and more about values. A place in criminology, in classrooms and seminars, the Menendez case is studied as a collision between law and psychology. It raises unresolved questions. How should courts evaluate abuse without physical evidence? Where does explanation end and justification begin? Can trauma mitigate culpability without erasing responsibility? There are no definitive answers, but the fact that the questions persist speaks to the case's enduring relevance. Comparisons and contradictions, when placed alongside other cases involving abuse-driven violence. The Menendez outcome appears inconsistent. Some defendants receive reduced sentences based on imperfect self-defense. Others receive life terms. This disparity highlights a central truth of criminal justice. Outcomes depend not only on facts, but on framing, timing, and what a courtroom permits itself to hear. The Menendez case becomes an illustration of that reality. Family, failure, and responsibility at its core, the case forces society to confront uncomfortable ethical questions. What happens when a family system fails completely, when warning signs are ignored, when silence is mistaken for stability? If intervention had come earlier by schools, communities, institutions, would the outcome have been different? And if so, where does responsibility truly lie? These questions extend beyond any verdict. Two lives, bound together eventually, the brothers are housed in the same facility. Observers note a stabilizing effect. They no longer seek to persuade the outside world. Their focus narrows to daily structure, mutual support, and endurance. For them, the trial is no longer ongoing. The sentence is not theoretical. It is lived, an unfinished legacy, more than 3 decades after the gunshots in Beverly Hills. The Menendez case remains unresolved, not legally, but culturally. It stands as a reminder that justice systems are built for clarity, while human experience is not. The case resists simple categorization. It challenges assumptions about victims, perpetrators, and the space between. Perhaps its most lasting contribution is this: it forces a reckoning with the idea that truth can be complete and incomplete at the same time. And as long as those questions continue to be asked, the Menendez case has not truly ended.